No need to panic. Could be critical. The odds are against you. Spider-Man faces 20 supervillains so powerful even with the Fantastic Four. His number may be up. Marvel Spider-Man, the video game from Acclaim.
Whoa, Spider-Man!
Sorry I can't hang around.
Because the action's at McDonald's. Now you can get a Spider-Man Happy Meal with cool characters and their hot cars.
Spider-Man, I just saw Scorpion in the drive-thru.
One with every Spider-Man Happy Meal you buy.
Everybody looks back on Batman the Animated Series with great fondness. It's not hard to see why though, considering it was a revolutionary show and spawned an animated universe that spun off into 8 different series. The popularity and dominance of Batman means Spider-Man the Animated Series, which came along 2 years later in 1994, is not really discussed as much. It's quite understandable that it doesn't have a bigger presence these days, considering it never really spawned a universe of shows in the way Batman did. Technically, it was part of an animated universe with X-Men, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, The Incredible Hulk, Silver Surfer, Spider-Man Unlimited, and Avengers United They Stand, but nobody ever mentions these shows outside of X-Men. A huge contributing factor of this never being as popular as DC's animated universe is because it wasn't controlled by the same people like DC's was, and there ended up being a number of contradictory things that popped up in shows. Spider-Man was by far their biggest success alongside X-Men, with both series receiving 5 seasons. Many of the writers who worked on this show also worked on Batman the Animated Series, which is a great place to start if you're making an animated superhero show. Spider-Man the Animated Series is one of the most well-received superhero shows, and it's touted as one of the most faithful animated adaptations of Spider-Man. With such great talent working on the show and universal praise, I'm excited to see what this series is all about. I have to get it out of the way early, but this show's intro is amazing, and it's not hard to see why it has become iconic. It was performed by Joe Perry from Aerosmith, and it's just so freaking good despite being pretty straightforward. As for the actual show itself, it's fantastic. In Spider-Man the Animated Series, we're dropped into Peter Parker's life after he's been Spider-Man for quite a bit. Peter's in college, and he's basically mastered his powers to this point. It's refreshing to see them going this route, as I feel like going through Peter's origin story is a pretty boring way to start. I don't have anything necessarily against starting with an origin story, but I just feel that unless you're doing something radically different with the origin, seeing Peter get bitten and then try to master his powers doesn't give you much room to be unique. Here we jump straight into Spider-Man being on top of his game. Because Peter is a college student here, we also get to see him working at the Daily Bugle, which opens up a whole other layer of story options and potential problems for him to face. One thing that becomes incredibly obvious from the very first episode is that the series relies heavily on broadcasting Spider-Man's inner dialogue. This reminded me a lot of the Spider-Man game released on PS1, which also brought you into his mind and you got to hear what he was thinking. A lot of great humour comes from Spidey's inner musings, and it actually serves as a very effective way to push along and develop the plot at times. While we don't get an origin story for Spider-Man, we do get several origin stories for the villains he faces.
Paid the price. Dr. Octavius vanished in that explosion, and Dr. Octopus was born.
However, not every villain is given an origin story. Some characters like the Lizard, Venom, and Scorpion are shown becoming a supervillain either in real time or through flashbacks, while others like Mysterio show up and their backstory isn't shown in detail at all. I think this is handled incredibly well, as when they do show an origin story, it's because it's integral to telling the story of the episode or setting up the character for later on. There are only 13 episodes here, and the writers have jam-packed the season with iconic villains. I already mentioned that Lizard, Venom, Scorpion, and Mysterio in the season, but this only scratches the surface. Spider-Man also faces off against Dr. Octopus, Rhino, Shocker, Hobgoblin, Norman Osborn, and Kingpin. Kingpin is always looming in the background here and is often pulling the strings behind the scenes for many of the problems caused by other villains. They're setting him up to be the biggest test for Spider-Man, and I can't wait to see them properly go up against each other. In the final episode, you're also introduced to Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D., which was unexpected and really opens up the universe. This, alongside Spider-Man making mentions about the Fantastic Four and Avengers among other heroes, makes you feel like this is a Marvel show rather than just an insular Spider-Man show. As I mentioned earlier, the show has a lot of the same writing talent that worked on Batman the Animated Series, and it shows. Something as simple as them constantly teasing Mary Jane's appearance throughout the first few episodes by sprinkling in mentions of her before she actually shows up is a nice touch, rather than just dumping the character on viewers. The writing here has a fair amount of depth to it. Peter has a lot of doubts about whether he's doing the right thing or not. The public aren't universally on his side, so when he messes up he receives an intense backlash. These moments have Peter reflecting on whether being Spider-Man is the right choice, and he often has to weigh up whether he's putting the people close to him in danger because of his alter ego. These moments are nice juxtapositions of the normal, jovial and wisecracking Spider-Man, and it makes him feel like a three-dimensional character. I alluded to it earlier, but many of the plot threads from individual episodes link up and generally lead back to Norman Osborn or Kingpin. Rarely is an episode truly a standalone, with the overwhelming majority linking into something bigger, which I'm a pretty big fan of. It essentially turns the 13 episodes into one big story, with a climatic conclusion fitting for a superhero television show. I only had a couple of very minor issues with the first season of Spider-Man the Animated Series. My first issue is the choice to blend 2D with 3D at times. The CGI in this show has not aged well at all, and I really can't imagine this looked very good even at the time. It's just horrendous, and shots would have looked about 1,000,000 times better if they had have stuck with 2D the entire time. My other issue was with episode 7, Kraven the Hunter. My issue with the episode is that it's just extremely boring and uninteresting. This is largely because Kraven is boring as heck compared to all the other Spider-Man villains here, but the episode itself is just uninteresting too. In the lead up to this episode we get stories featuring Doc Ock and Scorpion, while immediately following it we get a 3-parter featuring Rhino, Kingpin, the Symbiote, and Eddie Brock becoming Venom. Kraven the Hunter stands out like a sore thumb here, and I just couldn't wait for it to be over.
Saturday morning on Fox.
There's web in your eyes.
Go where you've never gone.
So fasten your safety belt.
See what you've never seen.
You lame brain. Nice to see you too.
Experience what you've never experienced.
Man, you are strong. But smell isn't everything.
It's the wondrous web world
Mommy, it's the big bug.
you've been waiting for.
He nails the dismount.
What's the incredible adventures of Spider-Man? Saturday morning on Fox.
Spider-Man the Animated Series gets off to a very strong start with Season 1. It brings out many of the heavy hitters in terms of villains and tells a mostly interconnected story that keeps you interested almost the entire way through. The incredible thing is they still have so many villains up their sleeves for future seasons. They're still yet to introduce Vulture, Sandman, Electro, Green Goblin, or even someone like Black Cat. The writers have done a fantastic job on the show and have honestly made it one of the most enjoyable superhero shows I've ever seen.